I'm talking today with James Kicklighter, who's the director and editor of the new documentary, The Sound of Identity. And I've known James for over 10 years. We first met on Twitter, but this is my first chance to really get to talk to him about his art. And I'm so excited to bring this to you. You'll see me gushing like crazy in this interview because I love this film so much, and I encourage you to watch it and read the interview also on pipelineartists.com. So here we go.
Film. I
Um,
was blown away with your comments. It was very, very kind, as I said.
okay, so I also gave the link to Matt, who's
Yeah,
my Matt Misitich from
right,
Pipeline,
right, right.
right? And we were gonna watch it together, and he was like, "I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying," because he's like, "But you better message me the second you're done." And I don't even I don't even know how to begin to tell you how moved I was. Like at the end I cried. Um I'm going to cry right now. It was so, when she said like I want to make you feel. That's what we do. You do. I do. Everyone who's trying to create art, you know, evoking emotion. The way it's not just her story, it's the way you directed it, the cinematography, the people. Even when you challenge that woman at Tulsa Opera, like
Mhm.
words not quite endorsed, like that one choice you made to break that wall and interject your own voice. Like there's just, I could literally have called you up right after and just talked about this for hours. Like,
I'm so glad it connected with you in that way. I mean, it's interesting you talk about that moment of breaking the fourth wall, which was something I went back and forth on, right? But I
yeah,
realized in that moment, because of all the things you described, right? I was trying to create a very cinematic, almost narrative documentary, right? It's certainly a documentary film, but I wanted it to feel almost like a scripted movie, which you probably could tell watching it.
oh, I was
And
thinking of,
and of course. And in that moment when you break the wall, it reminds the viewers that you're watching a documentary. But just from a pure storytelling perspective, I realize this isn't going to work if I don't interject. If I don't interject, this moment does not work. And so you have to do it. And sometimes, that's one of the great things about storytelling. It's about looking at things and saying, this may be the format that I'm trying to tell the story in, but if I don't do this thing, that moment doesn't work either, right?
yeah. And like I was even writing notes, like I didn't even go through these afterwards because I'm literally writing notes, like listing the stakes, like what's at stake. Like you did such a good job just from a structure standpoint, like understanding, okay, all these things are at stake, not just for her,
Right.
but for Tobias and, for the opera
The
house.
company, all of the different pieces, right? And it's, you walk into a documentary, especially thinking about, this is the thing on paper, right? The thing on paper is trans singer makes history at Tulsa Opera. That's the log line, but that's not the story. The story is much deeper and more complicated. And so I kind of saw all of those different elements as sort of a multi-layer cake, and you're hoping that each foundation that you're laying, all the pieces of setup, uh, work together to tell that singular story and converge in that moment you describe at the end where I want them to feel. Because I felt like if I could successfully juggle each of those story threads, that they converged into one singular story by the time we get to the third act. And that for me was a really challenging, perhaps risky creative thing to do
Mhm.
that took a lot of work and editing to make sure that made sense, that each of those stories did do that. The nice thing, of course, is when you have 30 days of contained filming with a specific endpoint, I do think it does help you to, get to that point, just because of the nature of the natural structure that was provided, which is you have 30 days to get ready for a show. The show is the endpoint, right?
Mhm. And, like, even your choice when I don't wanna give, like, spoilers to people, but even your choice at the end with with her father,
Hmm.
the subtext was there. We knew that that was a very emotional moment for her, and I could feel her staying a little guarded, like, just but hoping that when they went to that party after, that hopefully then she could breathe. Like, she's still coming off of the high of the performance, but then her father coming in and her sister, um, it that you handled that so beautifully because you still left it to be a little bit of a private moment for them, but allowed us to watch it and didn't I mean, it was just so tactful and
It
so
was delicate.
yeah.
It was delicate because there were two things in that moment. Of course, now we're talking about risks of storytelling, or
Mhm.
risks of the stakes of storytelling, right? I staked the entire film on that moment.
Yeah,
And a documentary that is you don't have any guarantee in a documentary that something's going to happen, right?
right.
You're unveiling things in order. We did not know definitively that her dad or sister would show up until the last day or two. We
Yeah,
did not know definitively that we would be able to go back and film that moment. And I certainly didn't know how it was going to happen. So when those three elements come into play, I've said this before, but I give my producers lots of credit for letting me make that decision because I'm sure I could have made a decent film without it, but I thought that was the emotional core of the story. The
mhm,
emotional core of the story is about reconciling the person you are versus the person that you want to be, right?
yeah,
And I felt that her story, if you strip away everything else, if you take away the opera, her being trans, her thoughts about identity, being an artist, it's really a story about someone who had this moment when they were 12 or 13 years old and how that totally changed the trajectory of their life. It's a universal story
mhm,
that I think a lot of people can relate to, about having to deal with that and having to deal with those traumas from your childhood
yeah,
and having this moment to reconcile. And so for me, because I had, my dad died when I was 12, so I kind of related to it in a different way, but still kind of got that. I felt that you had to treat it with the delicacy of the moment that it is. You don't want to over direct it, overshoot it. You want it to be natural because it's going to be awkward. And it's also a real human moment happening. It's not just happening in a film. This is their life. And so I have to be respectful of that.
yeah, and I think it's that, like, the other thing about her that you could relate to, like, I'm not a trans woman, I don't sing opera, but I'm an artist, so a
Mhm.
lot of her quotes, and I pulled a bunch of them out, like, that I just was, like, pausing and, like, typing because they speak to all artists, but then
Mhm.
there was her and I think this is one of the reasons why I think this documentary is probably one of the most important ones that I've seen. And it's because it speaks to everyone. And you don't have to be trans. You don't have to be an opera singer. You don't it's sort of like how what was the name of that miniseries that was out that had to do with chess? I'm forgetting it for the
Oh,
second.
The Queen's Gambit,
Yeah,
wonderful
like
show and great
right,
storytelling structure too.
right. But like you take this opera subject that I saw an opera once in Italy when I was, like, 14. Like, you know what I mean? But you take that
Right,
subject and you made me wanna go to the opera. You
right.
all but it's also the other element about her that that so many people can relate to, and it's something that I find popping up in conversation a lot with people is this disease to please, living with that disease to please, and her trying to overcome that. And even when she came out to her family, it was like, you don't have to like this. This is just what I'm doing. And it was so empowering. Like it like
Mhm.
the that she made so many, it's like you don't have to let other people rule your life. You have personal choice. You have the power of choice. And the choices that she made along the way are very inspiring. And honestly, I think you're going to, not only is this going to be a hit, like I think it's going to really change some people who watch this. It's going to change their lives. It's going to give
I
them.
hope so. To give them some hope, because I mean, two things you said in that were so important to me. I felt that, first of all, opera is perceived as a dead medium, right? And you don't think of opera in a modern context. And so I knew going into it that was the first challenge. How do you make this accessible to an audience? How do you make this something interesting so you might want to go to the opera, that you might want to see what's happening in that world that still exists, but something we just don't talk about in pop culture, really. And I felt, as I was observing in the first couple of days of filming, I realized this is a universal story, right? This is the story about an artist who, it might be at that moment in their career where they're going to make it, maybe. And that might happen, that might not. But this could be the moment they've worked their entire career for. And this is where she thought that this is where people become aware of her after working and doing all of the things you do to become an overnight success after 10 years of work, right? And that's what that moment is for her. And I realized if we tap into that, it doesn't matter if you like opera, if you have ever seen a film about someone who's transgender, that's the story you're watching. You're watching a story about someone who might make it. And I think that is a really powerful story for anyone who's an artist. It doesn't matter if you're an actor, a musician, a writer, director, or whatever, or even just somebody who likes to see an underdog win. I think that's a universal story. And then, second, of course, I think that in many films about LGBTQ issues, they usually tackle one or two things. In trans films in particular, it's usually always about transition. And I know I'm generalizing slightly, but I mean, if you think about it for a moment, anything in pop culture that is about transgender people, very few of those representations are about much more than the transition process. They tackle transition, how I transitioned, the details of my transition, all of that. And I'm not saying that that's not important. Sure, it's important to tell your story. And yes, it's important to have an identity. But I do think that if all we do as storytellers is tell stories about trans people in transition, then we are constantly otherizing folks and not giving them something else to root for, not giving the trans community hope or a role model or somebody to look up to, because all we're talking about is their transition. And I felt that was so important to skip right past that and talk about who she is today and how she got there, but also how her past affects her present without even discussing the transition, because that's not really what her story is about. Her story really is about what happened to her when she was a kid and her parents got divorced and how that changed her life. That's really what happened. And that's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, and I love that you just made the fact that she's trans just, it's, and even she said it herself. That's a small part of my life,
Hmm.
like, and
Right.
it was that whole, it was her whole life transitioned, not just her
Hmm.
body. Like when
Right.
she's making all of these artistic choices, and as an artist, I just kept looking at it from that perspective, and even how the juxtaposition of playing video games to use a different part of her
Hmm.
mind, like, and how you also, it's also a film about friendship and supporting
Hmm.
each other. Her relationship with Tobias, the director, like, he it was beautiful, and how you could see, I think really what the big thing, I came away with so many things, James, but one of the big things you come away with is that every person has a transition in themselves, whether it's a
Hmm.
physical transition or emotional transition or something. So you brought us to a place where we could relate to her. We could relate to a lot of people, the choreographer saying, I hope I didn't make this a freak show. Like you, and I'm sure you were thinking the same thing. How do I present this in a way that doesn't come across like I'm almost taking advantage of this titillating thing of, this trans woman doing the
Because that's the easy thing to do, right?
right.
In some ways, I think that is the easier way to, I'm sure you talk to 10 different people, they'll direct something 10 different ways. But I felt like, the same way as Denny Sayers, which she says, how am I not making Don Giovanni the show, not a freak show? I'm obviously thinking the exact same thing. That could be a
Yeah.
meta narrative within the film I'm making, right? To say that, how do I make this about not the thing. But I think that to me, successful storytelling in many ways is that too. I feel like if you do your job successfully, that's like I said at the beginning, there's a log line. Here's what should be on paper. But I think if you've done your job, usually it's not that thing.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's so relatable, and which was why it brought me to tears at the end. Because I was rooting for her. I was her. And even the Don Giovanni, like his
Hmm.
character, the multi layers of his character, it like couldn't have been a more perfect role for her to
Uh-huh.
enter this film. I mean, like there was so much. I mean, I guess we should back up. How did you even find
Yes.
this subject? I just want to talk to you
Yes. Well,
about the film too, but
of course, no, I can go. I'm happy to talk as much as you want. So Giovanni, I'll say this. I'm going to rewind a little bit. Two things you had mentioned with Tobias Picker. I didn't know that he was going to be as prominent in the story until the first week of filming. We shot that scene in the restaurant between Tobias and Lucia, and I knew in that moment. I turned around to the producers and said, "I can make the film I want to make." And two, Tobias is going to be a huge part of it because it's this interplay between the two, right? It's the mentor and the mentee. It's the person at the beginning of the career, the person at the end of their career, at the beginning of their life, getting towards the end of their life. It is yin and yang, and they work together in this beautiful way because, I think that we all in our lives have these mentors and mentees and people that we relate to, but there comes a point in our life, all of us, where we get to the point where we see less in front of us than behind. And it's about what are we going to leave behind? What are we going to do? And for Tobias, that's about advancing the rights of people that he didn't have when he was her age. And that I thought was really powerful and impactful because throughout the process, you're wondering, is this guy using her or is he advancing her? And that was kind of that
maybe both.
fascinating line that I wanted to play with throughout the film to kind of leave the audience questioning his motivations too, to say like everyone's got a point of view here and everyone has a different agenda. And so it's kind of navigating through those agendas, as I said earlier, to stream it all into one singular story. And of course, him choosing Giovanni, to your question, is that fascinating choice to me because that also is a kind of multi-layered character that's very complex, especially within modern dialogue with Me Too and all of the various social movements happening right now. Uh, I kind of took the multi-layered approach from the documentary, also from the show itself, because Don Giovanni, I felt was a character in the film just as much as Lucia was, just as much as Tobias was, et cetera, et cetera. And it's about someone who presents themselves in society as one thing and is something else behind closed doors and what that means. And I thought that was essential to that storytelling process. But I didn't know any of those things walking into this because I didn't know the story of Don Giovanni. I did not know much about opera. And so when the producers called me in 2019 saying, are you interested in doing this film? I told them, thank you, but no thank you, because I know nothing about opera. You should probably talk to someone else who knows more. And on the third call, they finally convinced me that because I didn't know much, that they felt I would bring a different approach to it, kind of look at with fresh eyes and a different kind of curiosity than somebody that really knew that world. And so I tried to, be a quick study of that. The thing that, drew me in initially, obviously, was the voice, because that notion of gender identity and vocal association was such an interesting topic to me. The idea that you have someone that presents as female but has a baritone voice, does it mean anything? Does it not mean anything? What does that mean in society with gender roles and all of these dialogues we're having right now? About identity. And when I interviewed Lucia on Skype in advance of filming, I knew instantaneously, I said, well, I have to do this film. This is going to be really interesting. And using the voice as the starting point is where, everything else comes from there. But that for me was the way in and why I was convinced to do it. It was so, I guess that answers your question, that I didn't actively pursue the film at first. They came to me, and then I was unsure about it, and then I was taken with the concept in Lucia and then did it. So it's a good example of sometimes you should take the risk. The thing that makes you nervous is usually the thing you should try to do.
100%. Like I always tell people, get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah,
Because when
yeah,
because you're uncomfortable for a reason. It's tapping into something that you should be challenging yourself to do. When you were talking about Lucia and Tobias, there's also this, it was the mentor and the mentee, but I also felt like at some point they became equals, and
correct.
it was beautiful watching that they understood each other, like when they played the video games. Like I've tried to play my
It was
video
the
game.
little thing, right? It's the little things like that. I remember there was a note I got from somebody to say, "Cut the video games. It has nothing to do with anything." I said, "I disagree. I said, I think that the video games are essential because, again, it's something that you don't expect. You think about the world of opera as this stuffy, dead medium, and here we have a opera singer playing video games in her off time to help her memorize stuff. I thought that was essential. And then when you have little moments like that, it humanizes folks because you put, again, the world that we're talking about is so cloistered off. It's extremely rare, I found out as well, for documentaries or films at all to be made about living opera stars. A lot of the time they happen when they're dead or when they're about to be. Not usually at the beginning, because it is such a cloistered world where there's a lot of, I wouldn't say hidden, but it's people really are protective of their identities in opera. They don't like people to come in and see process and such. And so when, I had a subject that was so willing to be open and we could find out they do stuff like video games, I just think it's very humanizing.
She's also just so smart, like
Yeah,
like this,
very intelligent.
very intelligent, and not just in IQ or whatever, but in
Mhm.
strategy, in career, in her own PR, like recognizing that yes, I'm trans and I'm doing an opera, and that could be perceived as like
Certainly,
I'm
well, she's
selling out
savvy, right?
for
Right,
right.
right. And are you selling out for identity? And obviously, that's a question we explore in the film because I was very interested in that. With the same cultural dialogue that we're having about Me Too and such, there's obviously a lot of dialogue right now about being a gay filmmaker or a female filmmaker or a person of color filmmaker, all of these different dialogues, which I think is important to, again, be clear. I don't think that's a bad thing. What I was interested in is how do we use that as currency, good, bad, or ugly? Because it is a currency. And I think that her discussion and Tobias's discussion of this throughout the film, this dialogue about how are we using this identity to bring in an audience? Is this good? Is this bad? Are we being exploitive? I thought that was a valid conversation because, again, I don't know if I've heard that conversation very much in media in the context of how we're talking about identities and representation, right? To say that, like, yes, we need representation, but is there a line in which that becomes you're using it as opposed to using it for the right reasons? And I thought that was an interesting question to look at.
I do too, and I like that you didn't have that question behind the scenes, that you shared that question.
No, you gotta bring it straight front and center because I felt that, as I said, when we're having all these discussions about representation, which are valid and much needed, I do think there's dark side to it as well, right? And I think that that's having that discussion on camera. I hope is a conversation that sparks some new thoughts in the midst of that dialogue.
Yeah, and I think it will. And I think it also put an exclamation on the point that when she says a small part of me is trans, like there's that's
Mhm.
just a small part of me, and that conversation speaks to that. And when she had that whole discussion, when she said singing is not my job, my job is traveling, my job is trying not to get sick,
Mhm.
my job is meeting people, networking, and you showed that part of her job. You showed her going
Mhm.
out handing out flyers, but having a difference of opinion with Tobias about what marketing this show was
Mhm.
should be, and her wanting this one-on-one and him wanting to just blast the town with flyers, like, she's smart. She knew that when she's on stage, she needs to connect with people and make them feel, but she also wanted to connect with people to get them to come to the stage. And
Correct. And
both
it's the business of it, right? And that's the business of, and not just, again, this is why I feel that I hope it will connect with a lot of audiences because it's a universal story. It's not just being on stage, it's not just making a film, it's not just writing an album, it's not just writing a screenplay or a book. It's about all that other stuff. And that's the stuff that, in trying to figure out how to structure a film, I realized really quickly, I said, it'd be very boring to sit here and just watch us do rehearsals for 90 minutes, right? You've got to see the other elements. And so to me, after that restaurant scene, I realized that was where I should kind of focus. That was only 6 days into filming, and we were filming for about 30 days. And in documentaries, you always have different people have different approaches, but for me, I kind of walk in with a general idea about what I want to do. And then as we're going through the process, I try to follow the story as it's happening and then say, this is the direction that I think we should go. And for me, on day 6, I knew that was the direction the film should go. That this is really about not just all of those other things we've discussed, but it's also about the sales process, as simple as that sounds, to say that, how do we sell this opera? How do we put this on? How does that get impacted by identity and how we're using identity, how we're marketing it? And that opens up the door to all kinds of discussions that, again, start flowing in the same direction.
Yeah. And she taps into when she said, I want you to love Giovanni and I want you to hate Giovanni. And I want you to hate that you love Giovanni. Do you know what I mean? Like that whole complex thing. And as a writer, when you're writing and you're creating characters, that's exactly the kind of character you want to create. And here you
Right.
are with this built-in character because of the opera that they chose. Oh, you know what I mean? Like it's what a gift. And oh, now I remember what I was going to say. The other gift was that you figured out that aha moment came 6 days in as opposed to
Mhm.
6 minutes towards the end.
Right. Exactly. And so for which I'm very lucky on, that's something that that's just the happenstance of the shooting process. And you know how I did that, and Lucia to probably tell you this too. I just filmed until they forget they're being filmed. And that's how you do this. And so it's a big challenge in the editing process. But for example, that one scene was a 2.5 hour dinner shoot that we shot, and you only see 5 minutes of it in the film. But there comes a point in filming projects like this where, one, you have to build the subject's trust, otherwise they're not going to open up to you. And then two, once you've built that trust, then they have to forget they're being filmed. And so we had cameras with very long lenses that were sharp and all of those things that enabled us to kind of hide and do multi-camera stuff. And I would be on the headset taking notes over here in the corner where they can't see me. And there just comes a point after you just keep shooting and shooting and shooting. Occasionally I'll yell in and interject for things, but you want to avoid that, because if you let the subject talk, they will start talking genuinely and they stop performing for the camera, and they start giving you something that is truthful. Even though they know they're filming, they forget about it. And that is where you start finding those moments. Sometimes it takes 2.5, 3 hours to film, but that's what you have to do. And you just really have to stay on top of it as you're shooting, kind of following that. narrative process, which is something I try to do. I note it as we're filming to say, okay, these are things we talked about. This is what they said. This is what I need to get to go in this direction. And that for me is very much part of the process. Just follow the story, listen to the subject, and evolve it in real time as you're going,
Yeah. And I
which
think
is different than writing a screenplay.
yeah, and it's so I'm so glad that you said that there about making the subject feel like they forget they're being filmed, because I actually said to myself in that scene while I was watching it, they've totally forgot the cameras are there. Like I
Oh, they did.
actually like said it in my head, like they have completely forgotten the cameras are there. And it showed, and it was so authentic, which again brings me to how Lucia was speaking so much about authenticity and living her authentic life. And I'm I don't know if you ever talked to her about, for her, like, and it's odd for me to ask you to speak for her, which is, you know, but if you
That's
ever
okay.
had a discussion about what the process felt like for her to actually have all of that out there, and whether there was any point you felt she was like having second thoughts, or like was it, do you know what I mean? Like, because it must be very conflicting.
Well, as a director, when you're making a film like this, it's a delicate balance because you want to get to the core of a character, but you don't want to get too close to the character because then you're not objective. And so I'm always asking myself in the filming process, and I think that you can probably sense this in the film too, is Lucia always being authentic? Which is kind of a question that I'm asking myself throughout the filming process. Is this a truthful answer? Is this, really what she means? Is she hiding something? And that's not a criticism of her, by the way, but it's just if you're revealing something, you always have to question a character's motivation. And so, do I think that there are moments in which, she had second thoughts about the filming process or wasn't sure? I'm totally sure that happened at some point, because I know I would sometimes ask questions that would be more provocative, or I'd be following something and it may be create more dramatic moments, some of which I included in the film, some of which I did not, because I mean you're doing two things here, right? You're trying to create an authentic film, but you also want to be an accurate representation of the person. I felt like if you have these big blowout dramatic moments that you sometimes see in films, that's not necessarily true to the character, because you also have to remember we are in a 30-day pressure cooker with a real opera happening that they're getting ready, that is following that real opera, international press that is following that opera, and all these people there are seeing these folks. And so you're having to reconcile as you're filming, is this moment authentic to who they are? When you're editing, is this moment authentic to them in that moment, or was this a heated moment that is not fair to show, right?
Mhm.
And so you're trying to negotiate all of those things and figure out, is this truthful?
But were there moments during this process where you ever felt a little scared that you were that this wasn't gonna
I bit
go
off more
well?
than I can chew. Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely there were a couple of moments in editing where I'm like, I'm in over my head on this, or, where are we? How am I going to cut this down? I think my first cut was like 3 hours, and I said that, there's no way I can cut any of this. How am I going to do that? And then you start honing in on, these moments and what the core of the story is. Just asking yourself, what's the core of this story, and what's the way you want to tell it? The first challenge in that, of course, is in the way I shot it, which was structuring everything around constantly getting bigger stages. The first stage Lucia is on is the smallest in the first act. The second act, the stage is slightly bigger, and the third is the big stage. I
Mm.
structured each interview and each line of questioning for her in the hopes that we would never go back to any of those stages, to kind of also emulate something about her career as a storytelling choice. Because I felt like that was, again, a life imitating art thing. We start out on a small stage, and if we're successful, it gets bigger and it gets bigger and gets bigger. And I thought that we had to do that. And so that was, again, like a risk I took in the filming process, that if you needed something, or if I needed something from interview one or two for interview three, that ruins that entire structure. And so I had to make sure in each of those sit down interviews that I got everything I needed for a first act, everything I needed for a second act, everything I needed for a third act.
Wow.
And that was an editing challenge for sure.
Wow.
I created that challenge for myself. So, I have no one to blame but myself.
But at some point, I mean, if it didn't work out, nobody would know
Yeah.
that you had planned that.
Maybe no one would know, but I can truthfully say that in the film, I did successfully pull that off. And I'm really proud of that from a,
Yeah.
editing and directing standpoint,
It's
frankly.
beautiful. I mean, just stunning. Was there anything that happened along the way that really surprised you?
The biggest surprise for me is there was no hellfire and brimstone. I was really expecting protests and, people really up in arms about it because we're in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so it's not like we're in New York or San Francisco or LA where this would probably be a non-event too, right? We talk about that in the film, that if you're in, Hideo Nori talks about how if this happened to any other major city, that's obvious people wouldn't necessarily pay the same attention to it. But because it's in Tulsa, it's a big event. It's a big international news story. It's a headline. And we really did think that there were going to be some of that sort of thing. And I was lucky that, or I guess lucky is not the right word. I'm glad that didn't happen. I'm glad that we did not do that because I didn't want to show that in the film, frankly. I would have if we needed to, but I felt like this is a story that's empowering. This is a story that shows that places like Tulsa are generalized, I think, as being one way or the other, when that's really not true. People talk so much about red states and blue states now, but I'm in Georgia at the moment, for where I grew up versus Atlanta, very different places. And I think sometimes we just lump places and people as one thing or the other, and
Yeah.
that's not true. Places like Tulsa can have something like this occur just as much as it could happen in New York or London or wherever else. And that was the biggest surprise for me, that all of those things that you expect, these preconceived notions that you are expecting, all of these protests and picketers and stuff to come, didn't happen, didn't occur. That
Which
was a surprise for me.
Yeah, which was great. And I loved her like walking up to that couple in the restaurant, like, and them having Tobias and her and Lucia having this sort of like, no, no, yes, no, no, yes.
Yeah.
And you could even tell that Lucia was just like, I don't really know if these people give a crap about this opera, but here you go.
But I'm gonna try it anyway.
Like,
And that's the thing, as an artist, I've said this, I sometimes mentor, younger filmmakers, although I'm not that old, but every once in a while I have somebody that's, 18 or 20 that calls me and or emails or something, and they ask advice about how to get attention to your work. And I always say that, no one cares you exist. I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but no one cares about what you're making until someone cares about it. And so you've got to be your own advocate. If you can't advocate for your own work, nobody else is going to do it, especially at the start of your career, right? You have to beg, plead, and steal and share and do all of those things to get people to watch what you're doing. And then hopefully there comes a time in your career where the New York Times writes about you or someone wants to talk about uh, the work that you made. And that, I think, is what you really see with Lucia, that even though she's having this moment where there's going to be all of this press, it doesn't matter if no one comes to the show in Tulsa. They've got to still show up in Tulsa because if people don't show up in Tulsa, all that other stuff isn't going to matter.
right, right, right. I mean, like, how are you feeling about the way the film is being received so far? With
So far, so good. It seems, I mean, we've gotten a couple of early reviews that have been good, which is always nice. As a filmmaker, as a director, writer, you get good reviews, you get bad reviews. And so that's part of the territory. If you don't want to, you know, deal with that, you shouldn't be in this business. Criticism is very, very big part of it. But the reception so far seems to be generally positive, and we'll see what happens. I kind of take the viewpoint that you do the best work you can, you put it out there, you hope somebody finds it, and then you do it again. And that's how I've always tried to look at it. If you get stuck on something or if something takes too long and you've just never put it out or you keep editing it to oblivion, you never move on. And so you've just got to, as an artist, have the discipline to say, this is the film I made. Now I made it, and now we move along. It took me about 2.5, 3 months to edit the film. And for me, when I was done with that, I'm happy with this edit. And when I watched it again the other day just to kind of remind myself of some things, and I felt generally good about it. Because sometimes I'll go back and watch things and say, "Oh, I should have cut those 5 minutes, or I should have cut that scene, or whatever." And I haven't had that feeling on this film yet. Maybe in 5 or 10 years I will, but at the moment, I'm like, I think that it's okay as it is.
And like I know when I'm writing something and you create these characters and you bring them to life, and then when you're done with the script or the book or whatever, and you put
Hmm.
it aside and you miss them and you whatever, but you created them. What is it like to like when you're working with these real people
Hmm.
and you've gotten to know them and then it's over? It's
Right. It's a different sort of relationship, isn't it? Because there's two things that I think about. One, again, they are real people, which means that the choices I make will impact real people in real life. So that is different than a created character, right? And so I have to be very cognizant of that. Is the representation that I'm providing of this person fair to who they are? It's even what I was saying earlier. There are moments when you're filming documentaries that can be very dramatic, moments that can be heated, whatever it is. Is that something that I have to have in my narrative? Is it something that advances the narrative? Is it something that's true to the person? If I can't answer all three of those questions, I don't need to put it in there because this is a real person who has real life consequences of the actions that I take. Um, so your relationship with them is only in that film because you are capturing 30 days of their life. 30 days of my life captured, your life captured, may be very different than something that happened for the other 11 months of the year, right? Just because of how it is. And so your relationship with them is kind of built upon that moment in time. It's built upon who they were then. That doesn't mean it's the totality of who they are. It doesn't mean that that is a total or complete representation of that person. Your relationship with them becomes that moment in time, that window. And that's not to say that we don't talk or that we haven't discussed things. We certainly have talked after, but that's where your relationship is. So it's a different sort of thing.
Yeah. And even with, creating film or any film or even just that opera, it's outside, even if you remove the documentary film.
Yeah.
Like Tobias was even saying, I don't know what our friendship is going to be after this. You know?
Right, because you don't. It's the same as making a film, right? Because I know on in films, there are some people that I have that come along on almost every project. I'm a director of photography. He's shot almost every film of mine. We were college roommates. We go way back. And so there are people like that. And then you have people that you have that work on one film and you never see them again. And so that's kind of the nature of the business, right? You have the people that you collect, and then you have the people that you work with once or twice, and then you never hear from them again. It's the same thing there in the opera, you know?
Do you have any like do you ever allow yourself, I guess I should say, to have expectations or hopes for what this will become?
I've learned to make no hopes.
Yes.
Because the thing is, always do you hope for the best? Sure, of course you do. But you know as well as I do that once you make something and you put it out, there's so much as a creative that you don't have control over. I don't have control over distribution. I don't have control over marketing. I don't have control over if someone decides to click it on iTunes and buy it or rent it. Those are things I have zero control over. And so what I can do is make the best film I can make, hope people like it, and talk about it until everyone doesn't want to hear about it anymore, and hope that people watch it. That's what I can do. And so I try to set those expectations for myself so that way, if things don't go well, you can say, I did the best thing I could. Someone might discover it later, and that's that. Uh, because if you set too high expectations, I think you'll always never reach your like reach satisfaction, right? You'll never be happy. I think you have to learn to be happy with the work you make, and if it is successful in that sense, of course, it's good for you and your career. Um, but if you're not making it for the right reasons, if you're not making it because you want to tell a good story or because you think that's interesting characters, I don't think you'll ever be satisfied. If you're doing it just for, fame or notoriety or people to say nice things about you on the internet, you're never going to be happy. You won't be.
People don't say nice things on the internet.
They don't say nice things. I do have
I try
I
to.
I've tried. I shouldn't do this, but I do. I do like to comment on YouTube videos of interviews of mine, or like films that go online. I will type little comments. I enjoy engaging with people like that, good, bad, or ugly. I
Yeah.
do enjoy that, and I do it. I shouldn't do it. It's probably not good for my mental health, but I do.
We do so many things that are not good for our mental health, like Twitter, but that's how we met.
Twitter,
So like,
exactly. I know it's that's one thing that I was thinking about. That's I'm so appreciative that you wanted to talk about this, because I think I'm pretty sure you have known me since at least I began 10 or 15 years ago.
yeah,
Because my very first film, The Car Wash, I think you had written about or tweeted about or something years ago. I was a student filmmaker, and so it's the same thing. I did an interview earlier today with another publication, and they're talking about the Macon Film Festival, which has programmed my work every year since I was 19. And so I have audiences there where I have the mama, the grandmama, the child, everybody, and they have been there every year since I was 19. So, like, for over a decade, I have watched these people grow up, get older, evolve, change, and every year they show up for that screening. And it's really neat when you can engage with people like yourself, people like that, and see that over time. It's cool.
it is. So I guess I'm just going to ask you one final question because
Yeah,
anything else I dive into would just, I just want people to watch the film.
I
You
do
know,
too. So we definitely share that view.
yeah, I mean, it's uh, so good. Okay,
Thank you. I am really proud of it, genuinely.
you should be.
I do think it's the best film I've ever made
I'm
for
proud
sure.
of
I have to say.
you. I'm proud
Thank you.
of Gucci. I'm proud of all of them. And I feel like since we did first meet on Twitter, I think I even saw some DMs from us from like
Yeah,
2010 or something.
right. Years
You
ago.
know, yeah,
Hmm.
years ago. Um, I love watching people. There's a lot of those people we met in
Hmm.
2009, 2010, on Twitter who are no longer doing this,
Yeah,
and
I think
so
about that a lot.
there's a lot,
I
and you wonder like what kept you in the game, you know, um,
mhm.
and if you could go back and give that student filmmaker who started his Twitter account, like some advice, like the 18-year-old you,
Mhm.
what would it be?
I think about this question a lot. Believe it or not, I do think about, because there's so many people I've worked with that don't work in film anymore, or people that wanted to that didn't. Some that were super talented, way more talented than me, that just didn't make it for some reason. I don't know if you ever make it, by the way, for the record. I think you're always scaling a new mountain if you're anything worth your salt, right? It's why I said at the very beginning about this film, it was something that scared me, so I knew I needed to do it. It was a new mountain to climb. When you're 18 and you're starting out in film, or 40 and starting out in film, people can start anytime, you have this idea in your head that if I can only get to the top of this mountain, everything's going to be great. That's all I have to do. I need to make my first feature film. I need to make my first short, whatever it is, and then I'm going to show it to everybody, and then I'm going to be wildly successful. That's what people tend to think. And the thing that I've learned is it's not about getting to the top of that mountain. It's about getting to the top of that mountain and seeing there's a whole chain ahead of you that you've got to get past. There isn't necessarily a firm destination for where your career is going to be. There is a series of events that will happen to you. You make work, you do things, you meet people. Some projects you make, some projects you don't make, things you develop, things that don't go forward, things that do. And you just have to keep making it. If you stop trying, or you hit this wall and you don't know how to get past that wall, you're going to fall out every time. Because I've had to learn, when I've made things that have gone well and things that haven't gone well, things that were in my control, things that were out of my control, choices I made that were good, choices that I made that were bad. It was about learning from that collective experience and saying, what is it that I need to move forward? How am I going to take this good or bad experience and move to the next thing? And sometimes that's really hard to do, especially when you're starting out and not independently wealthy. I did not grow up rich. I did not grow up from money. I grew up in a town of 123 people in the rural South. We did not have money. And so I didn't have some rich uncle that I could call when I was out of money or broke. I had to figure out how to do it. And so it means that sometimes you have to be resourceful. Sometimes you have to take jobs that you don't want to take. Sometimes it means that you have to edit or do an ad or do a corporate thing or do some stupid video for someone online that you don't really care anything about that doesn't even have your name on it. I have a lot of those that paid the bill
Mhm.
while you're trying to get the other thing to happen. Because it takes time to become a professional director, a professional writer, where people seek you out. You know, I got this film because I was sought out for it. It takes time to get to that point.
Yeah.
And if you are not finding ways to simultaneously uh, advance the work you're doing, continuing to make your work, and paying the bills, you're not going to get there. And I think that sometimes we can be too precious about the jobs we take because it's not the thing we want to do. Sometimes you need to take that job so you can do the thing you want to do. Um, and I think that when people fall out or, you know, leave the business that they wanted to go into, it's usually because they're not willing to do that work. They're not willing to wait. They think it's taking too long. They don't want to take that job because it's not the job they want. Usually, you have to do a series of things to get to that point. So you get to a point where you can make the things you want to make because you can make the best film in the world, as Lucia says about opera. And if you're just doing it in your living room, nobody's going to know.
Mhm.
And so you've got to get out of your living room. And once you get past that living room, you have to recognize that sometimes it's going to be effective and sometimes it's not. This film could be an epic flop. I have no idea. But I did the best work I could, put it out there, hope it's not. And if it does well, I'll probably get new opportunities. If it doesn't do well, I'll probably have to figure out what to do next. And that's just part of the business. You have to learn that skill. And it's just that constant ability to be able to do it, move on, and try again. That's what I would tell my 18-year-old self.
Mm. And that's great advice. And the one thing that you had said, like when you said this film could be an epic fail and you know, whatever. And that was, I'm sure, the same way Lucia felt when she
No,
this opera could be an epic fail. And
it
you
could be, and you never know, right?
never know.
Because it's like that's the only thing as an artist you have control over. You have control over your work, and you can make and sometimes you don't even have control over that, but that is a topic for a whole nother day. There are moments where you do not have control over your work. You know, I was lucky with this film where I did, but those are things that you just have to learn how to live with and learn how to move past. There's no I often say there's no wall around Hollywood. You know, there isn't a big wall to scale. You just have to learn how to walk in. And that sometimes means that the door opens really wide or it's a little bit of a crack and you have to figure out how to push it a little bit heavier. You know, there's no wall around Hollywood. You just have to slowly push it until you're getting to a point where you start making the things you want to make. And people always ask me, they're like, well, are you at this point now where you've done what you want to do? And, you know, the answer is always no, because there's always going to be something else, something new, some new challenge. And, you know, we'll see what the future holds. I hope that I keep working because I'm always, you know, in the back of my head, I always remind myself that, you know, that any day someone could stop calling me or, you know, maybe nobody wants me to work anymore. And so I try to be cognizant of that we are only as successful as our last project.
Well, I think on that note, I think you're going to be just fine. This
I hope.
from my
Fingers
mouth to
crossed.
God's ears because it's. I mean, I would literally. I showed my son the trailer, and he's 24,
Mhm.
and he had gotten his second vaccine, and I. Like the
That's
Italian mother
great.
I am, I went over to his house to take care of him to make sure he was
Of
okay,
course. Right.
of course. And I said, "Hey, I got to show you this trailer." And I showed him the trailer and he's like, "Holy God." He's like, "That is amazing. I want to see that." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll ask James if I can send you the link." Like, you know, and I'm like, "It comes out on June
It sounded like it's great.
1st." He's
And
like,
also, I don't know if you can. One of my earpods just died. Can you still hear me?
"Yes.
Okay, good.
Yep." and and I love that the trailer speaks to different generations, different genders, different whatever, like different perspectives. I mean, really, bravo and brava to Lucia. Like, just such
Thank
a
you.
beautiful job. And, maybe one day you two will come on our new podcast, Reckless
We
Creative.
would love that. We would love that. We'd be happy to do it. I, in fact, know Lucia would be more than happy to. She's ready to do anything. So let me know.
Yeah, we'd love to do it. We just recorded our first episode and it launched just yesterday or the day before.
That's great.
It's all about failure.
That's great. Oh, I know it's an important topic. Failure is really, that's another thing that I talk about a lot too. Failure is so important. People don't like to talk about failure because they feel like it's bad, but I think failure is great. The more that you fail, the more you learn. I think that your work improves when you fail. When you learn, it's not about failing, it's about learning why you failed and how not to do that again.
Yeah,
That's all it is. Failure is not bad. It's bad when you don't learn from your failure, when you keep
right.
repeating the same mistake over and over again. Uh, don't stay in the business because they don't recognize what that mistake is or what that failure is and why. So I always try to, at the end of everything, do a kind of post-op to kind of understand why something went well or why something didn't,
Right.
or why a film came out the way I wanted or why it didn't, what mistake I made, how it wasn't edited right, or if there was something that was beyond my control that I could do nothing about.
Yeah.
Those are things that you just really have to analyze to understand how to move forward.
Yeah. Like I always tell my kids, I never learned anything from my successes
Mm-mm.
except that you work hard and that helps,
You
but
work hard and you get results, but that's not always true, right?
not always.
Sometimes you work hard and it goes amiss.
Exactly. But that I've learned all of those really important lessons when I've been like crying on the bathroom floor, hit by a 2x4. Like
Right.
those are the lessons, and those are those defining moments for our characters, for your
Mhm.
documentaries, for life. Like, what choices are you going to make when you're in that moment, when everything
Mhm.
is lost? Like, are you going to pick yourself up and make some changes? And that's life. Failure
Yeah.
is life. I mean, it's
And I had a moment for my career. There's a film I directed in 2014 in India that I didn't have final cut on the film, and the producer ran off with it for a few months, edited it the way they wanted to make it, and it was I thought, terrible disaster. It was awful. I had a director's cut that I thought was much better. I know that's biased, but it was 20 minutes shorter. It was like I thought that was too bloated and it was a mess, and that was my moment for me. I was like, this film will not go the way I wanted it to, because and I have the film I want to make, but I can't make it. It's out
yeah,
of my control. And that for me was that moment to say, okay, I'm going to have to start over again here, because I thought this was going to be my moment where I'm going to make it, like Lucia has in this film. I thought
yeah,
that was going to be my moment, but it wasn't. And so I said, okay, if this isn't going to work, then what do I need to do to get to where I want to go? And so I spent, those couple of years reinventing myself, thinking about the work I've been making, saying, what is I'm doing well? What is it I'm not doing well? What can I improve? Who do I need to help? And, uh, and I think that because of that, I'm able to make stuff now like this that I think is, a fully formed thought that, has layers to it and hopefully connects with an audience in a kind of special way. That it's because I failed and because I had to figure out how to improve my own work for things that were in and not in my control.
yeah, yeah. Important, really, really important lessons. Like when I was in therapy, which everyone
Hmm.
should do,
And of
um,
course.
always. And I remember my therapist always saying to me, pay attention to what makes you cry. So
Hmm.
that was one thing when I was watching the film. And when Lucia would cry,
Hmm.
that's when I knew though that's what's important right there. That's not her acting. That's not
No.
her trying to manipulate anything.
Hmm.
That was real, those moments. And she teared
And getting to them, very challenging, because I knew that for me it was a really delicate balance, because you don't want to, as a director, I guess I'll leave you with this. When a documentary, you don't want to play your cards for the subject. If you play your cards for the subject, then they're going to perform for the film they think that you're making. They can't know at any moment what film I'm trying to make. That has to be something that I have kept from them because I don't want them to perform for me. I want them to react. That's directing people that are non-actors and actors. Unfortunately, I have experience with both, right? Because I've done narrative films and documentaries. So it makes it particularly tricky when you're directing an actor in a documentary that knows how to act and get them to be authentic without revealing the film you're going to make. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so,
Don Giovanni.
in those moments where she breaks down, they're all in the third act. And it's because I structured the film intentionally around that structure. And that, of course, is me manipulating the story for sure. But I knew that the film's emotional climax was the story of her and her father, which meant that I had to build up that narrative throughout the film, but wait until the third act to get her to break down about it because I felt like she was still holding it, guarding it. And I knew that if I did not get it until the very last moments, I would have tipped my hand to her as to what film I was making. And so those moments where she breaks down at the end of the film are literally in the last 10 minutes of filming her interview, the very last interview at the very end. And I structured the entire line of questioning for all three interviews to get to that point, and I was very fortunate to extract that from her directorially without her knowing what film I was trying to make.
Which is, I'm so glad you mentioned all of that because it's so
Yeah.
important. And also too, at that moment, you had the fortuitous happening of her being exhausted
Yeah.
and like
Yeah,
the
I banked on
adrenaline.
that. Like as I said, these are all like I'm not, some of it is, anytime you're doing a documentary, some of it's fortuitous circumstance too. But these things I planned on. I planned on her being tired. I planned on her doing all of that. And it's not me being manipulative, it's me trying to get something that's honest. Because I know that when you have a performer in a documentary, it's very easy for them to perform for the documentary. And so I wanted to get her to a place where A, she trusted me, but B, that enabled me to get to those moments that would hopefully be impactful for the viewer.
Yeah, and you succeeded.
Yeah.
That was
I
not.
learned it was something I learned. It was you learn something new on every project, and that I had never attempted to do something like that before, and that strategy worked. And now that I've revealed that strategy, I can never do it again because someone will see this interview and then they will know what I'm up to.
They'll be like, I know what he's doing to me.
I know what he's doing now, and now that's well, it's
Before
okay.
that,
But that's
and before the final interview, they'll be chugging Red Bull.
exactly the whole time. Exactly. The next time I make a documentary, but I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go back to doing a scripted film. As lovely as it's been, but I love making docs. I love making narrative films. But
You have a preference?
uh, I don't have a preference. It's always about the story.
Yeah.
The story is the most important thing, but I think that after doing two documentaries back to back, I'm ready to do a narrative film because you learn so much in each process.
Yeah.
And The Sound of Identity kind of feels like a narrative film. It's kind of a hybrid between the two in some ways. Um, but yeah, you want to do something different, or at least I do, because
Yeah.
Jonathan Demme and Sidney Lumet, who two of my favorite directors, they successfully went between doing narrative films and docs, and I hope to continue to emulate that.
Yeah, I think you will. And this is like feels like a good transition back into narrative,
Yeah, I think so. I
hybrid.
think so too. And so there's a script that I want to do a little bit later this year. Now that the pandemic is seemingly improving in the United States, I think that there's a better shot than not that we might be able to film that project. And so I'm really excited about that.
Good. And let me know about that next project.
I will.
And
I
then we
will.
can talk about that one too.
Yes, I'm so excited. It's a great script. It's a really, really good script. It's a Garden State kind of coming of age movie.
Yeah.
It's a 30 something coming of age story when you realize for the first time that your parents are getting older and what that means for you. It's a wonderful script. I'm excited
Yeah.
to do it.
And there's so many different things you go through at different stages of your
Hmm.
life, like that realization you think you're going to live forever. And then
No,
you
you're not.
your parents not.
I knew that at 12. And so
Yeah.
I kind of, for better or worse, had to develop emotionally in a very different way. And so I've always been drawn to those type of stories. I mean, The Sound of Identity certainly fits in that pantheon.
It does, it does. Well, James,
Hmm.
I'm so happy, and thank you for taking this time to
Yeah,
talk.
this was great. Well, thank you for asking me, and I can't wait to see what you say.